us with prayer?
Oh, I'd love to. Almighty God, there's a lot of work that's involved in doing your will, and we accept that joyfully. Tonight, we will be taking a look at how we can best support the wider church as well as the diocese. So please help us focus our minds. Let us ask whatever questions that we might have, and really realize that the reason we're doing this is to further your purpose here on earth. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you. Just spend a minute talking about Zoom manners. We're all such professionals now, but I'm going to try hard to keep you muted unless you are talking. So it just cuts down on the feedback that we get. There are 2 pages of you. We are happy to answer any questions. It's easiest if you raise your hand, your virtual hand, which I believe, I'm always the co-host, I believe that's under participants, although I know that there are some problems with this sometimes. You can raise your hand. If that
Gwen, on mine also under reactions.
Under reactions.
If you have a reactions button, yeah, you can raise your hand there too.
If that doesn't work, you can try actually waving your hand, and we will look for you. The problem with the reaction is it doesn't move you to the front page, whereas raising your hand does. So, but we will keep our eyes peeled. And if you've really been ignored for a very long time and you're just tired of waiting, just unmute yourself and say something, because. Yes. So we'll start with the joys of working on the parochial report. There are a few changes this year that I'm sure you have noticed. Let me share my screen. All right, so much of it is the same, but there are a few differences that I would like to point out to you. So if you click through on the link that we had, you can be following along here. Oh, and what I would also note is on that page, you will also see that there are walkthroughs, recorded walkthroughs, so you can use those to assist as you move through your report preparation. One of the things that is new on this first page is this bottom part here, parochial report. How many people participated and what are their roles? I'm pretty sure that's new, so I call that out to your attention. And Kirby asked me to point out that the reports are due by March 1st. And we really do need them by March 1st so that we have time to get them all finalized by May 1st to report in from a diocesan level. So please do everything you can to finish by March 1st, get those submitted. Going to the next page, increases and decreases during the year. These things haven't changed. I would just encourage you, if you are at one of those churches and maybe you're new there and you're at one of those churches that is still hanging on to some Glory Days membership numbers that have not been realistic for years and nobody wants to change them because they're afraid it's going to look like a hit on them. 2020 is going to be going to be so bad all around for everyone that it seems to me this is the year to go ahead and I see Paige is crying. This is the year to take that plunge and clean up those membership numbers. It'll make it so much easier for you next year. And I understand why it doesn't happen, but this would be the year. So this top part has not changed. On line 7, we see the first important change. Average Sunday attendance is only going to include January and February. So you do not have to worry about the numbers after that time. You will also notice that there's no mention of Easter service here. That was always something that you put in, you know, what was your Easter Sunday attendance? Well, Easter was in quarantine, so it doesn't matter anymore in terms of the parochial report. Starting on line 10 through 21, they've got these 2 categories, and basically it is an in-person service if there is even one person present who would be considered the congregation. So if your spouse came while you were recording Eucharist and he or she was just there to watch, it's an in-person service. Or to participate, it's an in-person service. If everyone who is there is involved in the actual worship and no one is extraneous, then it's an online service. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. You pre-record your service on Thursday afternoon, and everyone who's in the room, you do it in your worship space. And I see Steve, and I'll come back to you, and Janine. You do it in your worship space. And one person is recording, one person is playing the organ, one person is doing the readings, and you're there as the celebrant. And that's it. That would be considered an online service. All right? And you're going to stream that. Take that same situation, and 2 members of the altar guild see that worship is going on and the space is big enough that they can safely do this. They sit down and participate. It is now an in-person service. So the bottom line is all of this is informational for TEC. They can't really, I mean, how are they going to use it? I don't know, but it's not something that I think you need to worry about, because of course, throughout the year, you didn't pay attention to this, did you? And so how are you going to know actually? So just do your best. Janine?
So I listened to your 2 examples, but I'm still a little bit confused. If I have the worship team, the liturgical servants there, and then I also have like a producer, you know, the person who's pressing the go live or record a button or whatever. There were times when we were doing it on Saturday and then putting it up for Facebook and Zoom on Sunday. Are you saying that I've done 2 services, an in-person service for the people who were, okay, just count it as one thing or another? It's either an in-service.
Count it as one thing or another.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yes, and Paige asked the same question. Count it as one thing or the other. And like I said, do your best, because I'm guessing that you're not going to know, you know, if on August whatever you had an extra person sitting there in the worship space because somebody couldn't drive that day and so their spouse sat in waiting to pick them up. You're not going to know that, and so just do your best. Karen and then Richard.
So if you are live streaming out of your church but there is no one attending other than the people participating. Are you in person or are you online?
That is online because there's no one else there participating.
Okay.
This is Steve. I have a
Yeah.
question about this Eucharist line 10.
Yes.
We have, for a while we had, we did outside services when we could because it was allowed. But subsequent to the bishop's direction, we have done everything by Zoom. It's a service, but there's no Eucharist. So where does that fit in here?
That would be considered
Daily offices on Sunday or something.
daily office.
Yeah.
You would put it on line 13.
What if you take a spiritual communion?
No, only if there was actually communion celebrated.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Richard.
I think I know the answer to this. So we're not recording in our registers online services at all.
Say that again.
We're not recording in our registers online services at all.
I would be keeping track in my register.
Okay, because I've kept it on a piece of paper, but
No, that's better
you want
than
it in there?
not keeping. I would put it in your church register. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Not that I think we had really received any particular guidance on that.
I thought we were told not to, but I could be wrong.
If it was me, I'd put it in there.
Okay.
Just because then it's all in one place. Because years from now, when historians want to dig deep and see how this all went, they're not going to want to look at some separate piece of paper. They're going to want it in your register. So,
Okay. I'll spend the night transcribing.
Paige and then Kent.
We have, I indicated in the chat, we're pretty compulsive. And so early on, we made a Google document that we could manage from home with all the everything. We actually had more information than this requests. We had, total views. We have all the things.
We'll get there, Paige.
So I guess what I was going to offer is if anyone wants, it's early enough in the year, I'm happy to share that Google Doc with you to then manage and make it work for your situation if you want. I'm happy to share that. Just send me an email. I'll put my email in the chat.
Excellent. Kent and then Roger.
Yes, I assume then for us all, if we stop doing Eucharist with the pandemic, then in line 10, we're going to have January and February numbers.
Yes.
And then those would all be in person. Then we'd go down to 13 and fill in how many services we did online. That's what it
Yes.
sounds like to me.
Yes. And the only complicating feature, but again, you might not know, and so I wouldn't worry too much about it, if somebody happened to be sitting there in the queue observing. But like I said, you weren't keeping track of that. So
Yeah,
Oh,
we
I
are.
always keep track of those things. If you've been there 3 times, then you're a member, right? Or in good standing.
yes.
You've already on the vestry. You couldn't.
That's right.
Roger.
Liturgy of the Word with spiritual communion is considered an office? That's a question.
Yeah, it's considered morning prayer.
It
Yep.
is?
Because you did not, there's no epiclesis.
Okay.
You'll notice that all of the baptisms and confirmations, etc., fall into the in-person, even if there was just a few of you, because the baptizand, for example, would be that extra person, that congregant. So they then are asking for a lot of information, mainly for information's sake, what was the impact on participation of children and youth, et cetera. And then questions about Did you offer online worship before? What platforms are you using? How are you counting? If you are counting, how have you been counting, etc. And then there's also questions about racial justice and reconciliation. So that's my portion. Richard, do you still have a question? Okay, let me lower your hand for you. Kirby is now going to, unless there are any further questions, Kirby's going to talk about the financial part.
That's
Okay.
the worst part.
That's the best part. You're right.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Gwen, can I do one question real quick? I'm muted, I think.
Kirby is muted, and
Yep.
yes, Dave, you can answer one question before
right.
we get rolling.
In the information that was sent out, when we go to Zoom, we go to online worship, whether it's whatever social media is, it says we should count those that there's a place to count those that have been there that came to view for 1 minute or less. And then there's another application for those that came to view for 3 minutes or more. We didn't address that. Is that something we should do on our own?
That is something you would do on your own. I'm not sure what they're doing for what they're asking for this year. We probably all need to review, and I'm not prepared to do that right now. I'll need to review what the request is this year so that as you begin the year, you can start to keep track of things, and Paige's document might be a big help there.
Well, I think that was on the original stuff from the church, but that wasn't on this paperwork about how many people.
Right,
When you say
because-
like, well, we had 800 views, well, what does that mean? How many people just popped in and popped out, but how many actually stayed for a while?
And they're not asking you to report on that in this year's parochial report.
Okay, thank you.
Now, I would guess they'll want to know something next year, but that's a guess. Kirby, now
Okay.
that you are
Are
unmuted.
we ready? Now that I'm unmuted. I just wanted to mention to you, we will keep this same form up and I will be addressing the line items, but the information that I'll be using is in the instruction book, the workbook, which is also on that link. That was the same place where you could get a hold of this form. So the first thing I want to mention is that this form can be filled out either on a cash basis or accrual basis. They really don't care either one. The only thing they want is to make sure it's done consistently. So you have that option. And by the way, I'm not going to go through each line item. I think some are pretty self-explanatory. For instance, for the number of pledges, lines 1 and 2.
You're muted again.
Thank you. I'm not touching anything. I don't know why. Gwen, are you doing that to me? Okay. Well, I'll try to pay attention more to whether I'm muted, but yeah, I'm not doing anything. Okay. So I'm not sure where I left off. Anyway, for lines 1 and 2, those have to be actual pledges. You might have regular givers. They'll go down on line 3, but these are pledge cards that you have in the amounts on those pledge cards. In the instructions, the main thing to remember in this is that you're going to be starting with, Janine, your message is right in front of what I have to take a look at. Line E is the starting point. Those are operating expenses. So that's the amount that you'll be taking from your financial reports. The whole purpose of this form is to explain how you are paying for your operating expenses. That's why we're starting with that. So take that full number on there and then everything else will be derived from there. So just about in all cases, line E is going to, Gwen, could you move that up a little bit for me? There we go. Line E, which is operating expenses, is going to equal line B, operating revenues. So keep that in mind as we're going through this. And very rarely will everything equal. So if you have to plug a number, which generally will, Gwen, could you move it down a little bit more for me?
Yes, I was trying to answer, I'm multitasking and answering Janine's question. So where am I going?
Okay, sorry. Down so I can see line 4.
You mean money from investments? You can't see that? Oh, okay. Now can you?
A little bit more. Okay, there we go. So if it turns out your operating expenses are more than operating revenues, the plug is going to be in line 4. So in theory, it means if you're short cash, you're going to have to take that from a savings account, from an investment account, or some other kind of account. The opposite is, Gwen, now if you can move it up for me, for line 9. There we go. If you have more revenues than you do expenses, it's going to go into line 9. That's where a surplus would be indicated. So this is a very broad kind of rule that we have, because people really start wondering how it interfaces directly with all the accounts you have on your chart of accounts. This is just a way of, we're going to represent either surpluses or deficits. But remember, line E, operating expenses, is going to equal line A, just about in all cases.
Kirby, before
Okay.
you go further, there's a question from Galaxy Note 9.
Oh,
That's me, Cindy.
hi, Cindy.
Hi, Cindy.
Hi. Okay, so I have a question about that. How does your PPP loan and the EIDO come into play with this? Because that's the money that was plugging the revenues for us.
Yep, you're jumping ahead. I'm going to get there because there's a real special place for that.
Okay, so then on this page alone, number 4 doesn't 100% cover it, right? Because we're going to...
That's going to
Okay.
be at the very end, once you take into account your PPP loan and such. So hold that thought. If I don't answer it directly, let me know, okay?
Okay.
Judy, I noticed that you had your hand up too.
Yeah, I just want to clarify, Kirby. You said line E must equal line B or A?
Yes, B.
Okay. The second time around, you said A, and I wanted to make sure that.
Oh,
we were
I'm
clear.
sorry. I
That's
misspoke.
okay. That's
It's
all right.
line
Thanks.
B. Okay, so now we'll continue on then with the instructions. So I'm going to read something to you that's actually in those instructions, but that I want to make sure that it's really clear. All funds from whatever source that are used for the general operation of the congregation are operating revenues. The general operation of the congregation includes, but is not limited to, compensation of clergy and lay staff, all expenses related to operating and insuring the buildings, expenses of the music program, church school, adult education programs, flowers, supplies of the altar, diocesan assessment, and office expenses. And here they even underline, say, important note, because operating revenues are defined as the funds that are used to pay operating expenses, operating income will typically equal or nearly equal operating expenses. If this report is completed correctly, there will usually be no significant difference between total operating revenues and total operating expenses. Also, all figures reported in this section must be positive numbers. That is, a stock market loss is not reported as negative income value, for example, but rather is reflected in the total value of investments for 2020. I know that's a lot, and it's all written down on that workbook instruction. So I really advise you going through there line by line, because they provide some really good examples that will help clarify the situation. Okay, now let's talk about restricted or designated funds, because those sometimes go into paying for operating revenues. So the difference, most of you know this already, but I just want to be clear about it. A restricted fund is one where the donor puts on the restriction. Now, it can be that a restricted fund will be used to pay for operations. So therefore, that would be considered operating revenue because it's used to pay operating expenses. Same thing with a designated fund. The vestry might have set aside some money for something, maybe a clergy salary or something like that. If it's used for operations, it's going to become part of operating revenues. On the other hand, if it's not, if it's outside of operations, let's say to a building fund or something like that, that will still remain outside of the operating expenses. Okay, any questions on that? All right, next then. There are 3 different ways that we represent outreach on this report, and each of them are handled a little bit differently. But this is an area that the wider church is interested in, so that's why they break it down. The first way is if there is a special appeal for an outreach program that's outside of the parish. Okay, so you have a bake sale because you want to donate money to Habitat for Humanity. That's one way. The way you report that is on lines 11, funds for transmittal to other organizations, and then line 18, funds sent to other organizations. So please note, those are outside of operating expenses and revenues. That won't have any effect on the assessment that you have. And they'll just about always equal, but that's sometimes you might have the fundraiser in December, you're not expending the funds until January in a different year. They'll be different in that case, but if you raise the funds in the same year you're going to spend them, those numbers are going to be equal. Okay, the second way is if you have a special appeal, but it's for an outreach program that's within the church. In that case, the appeal money is going to be on line 10. So contributions and grants for congregation-based outreach. And then the expenses are going to be on line 16. Expenses for congregations, outreach, and ministry. Okay, so the first way is you raise money for something happening outside of the church. Second way, you raise money for something that's happening inside the church. And then the third way is just a straight line item budget you have for outreach, that it's part of your operating expenses. And in that case, it's going to be on line 13. The only little caveat I want to do, if you, under the first example, you raise money for something outside of the church, if part of that happens to be for seminaries, then break that out separately in line 17. Otherwise, everything else would be to other organizations. So that's the quirkiness that we have on the parochial report as far as outreach goes. Any questions about that? Okay, if anything comes up later, just let me know.
Kirby?
Yeah.
I had, this is Rick. I had a quick question. I sort of missed out on your third one where you referred to item 13. If you wouldn't mind repeating that, sorry.
Oh, sure. That is just a straight line item in your budget that you have for outreach. So you're not raising any additional funds. So quite a few of the congregations will have that. You know, they just have a line item for outreach, and then line 13 is where that would go. Okay. Let's go to line 4, which is money from investments used for operations. So again, I'll read from the instructions. It says, money from investments used for operations does not, and it's underlined, mean investment funds that could be used for operations, and otherwise your total investment portfolio. it means all amounts from investments that were actually transferred into operating accounts or used for operating expenses during the current year. So there are a couple ways that congregations do this. One would be using or relieving or releasing restricted funds that are used. I had already mentioned that part. Now, if there are withdrawals of principal that's used for operations, you have to include that. Remember, anything for operating expenses, you have to explain how that's being paid for. Now, a lot of congregations have a policy, and frankly, the diocese does too, where we have a rolling average, and then we take a certain percentage. So sometimes it might be only interest or dividends. Other times you might have to dip into principal, but you have like 4% based on a 3-year rolling average. Then that policy will dictate how much money is coming over. Now, you don't necessarily have to transfer that money into your bank account. You can have it still sitting in your investment account, but if you recognize the revenue, then you have to put that into to offset the operating expenses. So that would be part of your operating income. And that's what this line 4 is all about. Everyone really confused about that? Yeah, it's a little odd. Again, go back to this section and read through it. And if you still have questions, just let me know. I'm happy to correspond with you via email. I noticed Gwen just put our emails down in the chat. So it takes living with it a little while and reading through the examples, but I think you'll be able to get the hang of it. Okay, so moving on is line 5, and we'll be covering PPP in just a second. So here's an example. If you have rental income, I know several congregations do have tenants. So according to the instructions here, you take the gross amount of the income that you have, but you take out the operating expenses. So let's say that you have a school that's on your property and you allocate, let's say, 50% of the utilities to them. So what you're going to do is take the gross amount of the income, subtract out the 50% of the utilities, then you have what the net rental income is. Same thing for fundraising events. If you decide to have some whopping fundraising event and it costs some money to put that on, you have to rent tents or a sound system or something like that, you're going to take the net amount. That's what's going to be represented in this line 5. So the addition they have here is regarding PPP loans. Only if your loan has been or converted into a grant will you report that here. Because by definition, a PPP loan / grant was used to pay for payroll, for rent, for utilities, for certain things like that. So by definition, it went to offset operating expenses, and that's where it's represented. If it has not yet been converted to a grant as of December 31st, you don't put that in here. Then it's reported on line 22. Either a loan or a grant is going to be reported on line 22. Thanks, Gwen. All right. Karen?
Yeah, so Kirby, how does somebody like Holy Cross deal with that since you applied on our behalf?
Yeah, there weren't explicit instructions, but what I am going to recommend to all of the missions that did receive some money from the diocesan PPP loan is to include that, because essentially it was, it did go to offset your operating expenses.
So just to be clear, Kirby, even though we have not yet gotten that converted?
That's right. The diocese has not yet converted. So you would not have to worry about that, Karen. But I take that back. Because you do have assistance from the diocese on the operating budget number, line number 7. But that's where that should be reported.
So we'd record the COVID grant we got, as well as the PPP funding portion that we got as well on line 7.
Yep.
Okay. Oh, that's important.
Yeah, that's assistance from the diocese, and the diocese had done that on your behalf. Now, for congregations that had their own PPPs, you would follow these instructions. Then if it's converted before the year end, included in line 5, otherwise it just goes into 22.
Okay.
Roger, it looks like you're kind of raising your hand visually. Yes, no?
You're right. I am kind of raising my hand. What line were we talking about?
Line 5.
7.
Oh, 7.
Is property grant included in line 7?
Yeah. Oh, hang on a second, though. That's a good question. Normally, property grants are going to be used for capital purposes. In other words, putting on a new roof or painting or something like that. And that amount is capitalized. That's not considered an operating expense. Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. However, if you had like an old-fashioned fearless love or multicultural or something like that, those are more than likely going to be operating expenses. So those grants should be reported too. I see Galaxy 9 raised hand. Oh, that's Cindy. Oh, you're still muted, Cindy.
Okay, here. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so we got the multicultural grant, but because of COVID, we just didn't use it this year. So I'm assuming that's not reported because we're not, I mean, it's just waiting for us to use it when we open up again. Is that correct? We don't report it, or do we report it even though it wasn't used?
Well, since it wasn't used, that means you didn't incur the expenses, so you would not report the income.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But just as an aside, I believe at the end of the year, if you have not used the grant, you need to notify the diocese, and the diocese will make a decision whether to carry it over or whether you need to pay it back. But that's
Okay.
and that's a separate conversation, but I believe that that's how it works.
Okay, I'll let them know.
Okay.
Thank you.
Cindy, I'm still learning, so Kirby's undoubtedly right. So why don't you send me an email with that information?
Okay.
I can't imagine it's going to, I'm speaking for executive council. I can't imagine it's a problem because there was this thing called COVID, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we covered line 7 pretty well. Now, I do want to mention some of the aid that was provided to congregations was CLS waivers. So in some cases, we were able to provide that support for you. That amount really should go into line 7 because normally you were obligated to use that those funds in order to, that would be considered an operation expenses. So it would be as if we wrote you a check to support that amount. We didn't write the check, we forgave the amount. So those CLS waivers, the CLS grants should go into line 7.
Would that include pension waivers as well?
Pension was actually granted by the by CPG.
Yeah. So I think
I don't think those have to go on this.
Okay.
Judy Brown had her hand up, but she has gone away.
I went away because you just answered the question.
Nice.
Oh, perfect. Okay. All right. So any questions on operating revenues? I know that was a lot. Remember, we're just offsetting the operating expenses, which we're going to talk about. Well, first, let's do the non-operating revenue. So starting with line 8 through 11. Oh, Aaron Sacapineta had a comment in chat, so please take a look at that too. All right. This section, non-operating revenues, really hasn't changed. We already covered some of those, particularly line 11 and line 10. So for line 9, in addition to if you have any surpluses or revenues exceeding operating expenses, that would go on line 9. If you have a bequest by someone, that would go into here as well. Capital funds, Roger, that would go to your point. I think this would be a good place to indicate what you received from a property grant. Okay, so let's go on into, let's talk about loans for just a minute. Aside from the PPP loan, I'm going to read from this part too, because it's important. Report only new grants and contributions for capital purposes. We're talking about line 8. Do not show interest, dividends, gains, or losses on capital funds invested or loans. Loans are not considered income. If you get a loan to fix the roof, do not include the loan proceeds on line 8. You will show the money raised to pay it back on line 8 and the actual repayment of the loan on line 15. That's probably clear as mud. But note, both of those are outside of operating expenses. And these are for capital purposes, you know, building a new bathroom or putting a roof on or those kinds of things. So I refer to you again to the instruction book. All right. Let's go into operating expenses. I already read to you kind of a general definition of what those are, but you'll note there's only 3 line items that you have. Remember, you're going to be starting with line E. So out of that, you're going to be able to say what the CLS was. That goes on line 12. Line 13 was the outreach from your operating budget. That should be easy to find too. Everything else, salaries, insurance, all of that stuff's going to go on line 14. So virtually everything goes on line 14 except for those 2 items. So that's pretty easy to derive. So now the non-operating expenses, we'll start in line 15. And those are pretty self-explanatory as well. Remember, we already talked about line 18 and line 17 and line 16. Okay. No questions right now on those items. Lines 19 and 20 are the same from last year. These are the amount of cash and the amount of investment. So that can pretty much be taken from your balance sheet. So just a snapshot as of December 31st, what was in those accounts. Okay, Gwen, if you can move up. So, some of the newer portions, this is a brand new page, and those are self-explanatory too. Line 22, remember, if you received a loan at all from PPP, that's where it needs to go in. And the rest of it, they're just collecting data. And right now, Gwen, if you go back to line 20 for just a second, please. There we go. I just want to remind you, in case you don't know, every single congregation has some money in the Episcopal Church Foundation. It's part of a trust that Bishop Mathis set up. So I think he seeded it with like $100 or something like that, maybe 200. Everybody has that. And if you don't have it on your balance sheet, you ought to think about putting it on, even though it might be a small amount. And this is a very easy way for you to start setting money aside. You already have an investment account set up. It's already managed by the investment committee because the diocese has part of its investment in that. So every quarter we get an update on that. So please take advantage of it. This is a time, hopefully, if you have any small surplus or something, go ahead and squirrel it away. And this would be a good place to do that. All right, that was my non-paid promotional commercial. All right, that's all I had for the financial part. thanks very much. Oh, I see. Cindy, you have another question? Cindy, I see your hand raised. Is that still, do you have a question?
I'm sorry, it keeps muting me. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so can you take back, please, the PPP loan and the EIDL advance? I would assume at the EIDL, that'll go into our income, but the PPP, since it wasn't forgiven, we used it for operating. So how can we have our line B equal line E when we use this PPP loan that hasn't been officially forgiven yet?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm sure we're going to need to have more instruction on how to handle a PPP, because they're treating it as a straight loan. And the thing I read for you is loan is not considered income. But
right.
Oh, Aaron, how nice to have a CPA online. Please, can you comment for us?
Hi, everybody. So I read on this under page 5 in that blue text where it says converted to grant. When I read that, I think it's interesting that they use the phrase converted to grant and they didn't use the phrase forgiven right there. And the reason I think that's interesting is because accounting principles would indicate different qualifiers pertaining to when you would recognize something as revenue. And basically when conditions are being met, and having used the PPP money for eligible expenses is what the church did in order to make it eligible to be forgiven or to be converted to a grant. So I intend, frankly, for these that I do, to indicate the PPP loan amounts on that line 5, regardless of whether or not they've been forgiven, if I know that they were fully used for eligible expenses.
Aaron, what would be the risk of that if it doesn't end up being forgiven, or if it doesn't end up being forgiven?
My experience is they will be, just because I've done 12 of these this year or whatever it is, and there's been really no problems with getting them forgiven, largely because the 8-week limit on the original PPPs moved to 24 weeks. So your loan amounts generally, unless you really did just cut all your staff, which I'm not sure any church could have done that and continue to operate. In 24 weeks, you certainly spent those funds on payroll related expenses, if not other costs.
Yeah.
So I think the risk is very, very low. Gwynn, is that what I'm saying?
Okay.
Aaron, I think you've converted me. We had a difference of opinion before, but I think that makes sense here. And that gets to what Cindy's concern was, because you are using it for operating expenses. Cindy,
if it's said right there, instead of converted to grant, if it's specifically actually said has not been forgiven, I would be hesitating a bit more about it. But I'm dealing with the same question that Cindy brought up, largely also because of this second drop PPP thing we're dealing with right now. And it really, to have to remember what you did with that money this year and going into next year's Parochial report, I think it's much cleaner to deal with 2020, close it out, and then deal with 2021 separate in this regard.
Let's handle it that way. If I receive anything to the contrary, I'll be sure to let all the congregations know, but I think that makes the most sense. It really does. Okay, Cindy, your hand is still up. Did you have another question?
I do. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Question in regards to what line we should use we sold property. I don't know if you guys, I'm sure you guys know that we sold property, and a little bit of that money we set aside to put into our meeting as a just in case it got really bad and we didn't bring in enough funds. So some of it has been used. So I would count that on line, but would that be on?
Well, the
5?
amount that you, the amount that you actually used would be on line 5.
On 5. Okay, that's what I wanted to know. Okay.
Steve? Looks like you're muted,
Then
Steve.
we have
Oh.
PPP. We treat it as a loan at the moment because we have not been forgiven. We have used it all, however, we used, whatever we had was certainly used to pay payroll for an 8-week period of time when we had no money coming in from rent. So would I put it in 5 as well as down where it asks the question, did you get PPP?
Well, regardless, you have to report it on line 22.
Right.
That's
no
whether
sweat.
it's a loan or a grant. So that's a given. Now, then what you're asking is similar to what Aaron was addressing, and that is, we're recommending at this point just putting it into line 5 if you've used all that money.
Okay,
So
no
then-
problem.
I have another question.
Sure.
So then if you do use that PPP loan, then on number 23, are we going to just say it was forgiven, assuming it's going to be forgiven?
I don't think they're going to try to reconcile those two things. I would say, go ahead and say whether it has been forgiven as of the end of the year, yes or no. Or it could be in
Okay.
process too. I mean, if a lot of places have already, they're getting their information together.
Well, actually, I spoke to our bank and they said they put a stop on reviewing any of the applications because now the government is increasing the amount for automatically forgiven up to 150,000. So they put a stop on reviewing any of those, even though they're already starting to take the second round of PPP applications. They're not going to do anything about forgiving the first round yet.
Yeah, I'm sure those poor banks are really overworked at this point. So yeah, I can
Sure,
understand why
yeah.
they're doing that.
So we really should say not forgiven or in process. Really, it's in process.
Yeah, if you started the process, just put whatever is applicable there. I did
Okay.
notice Aaron had another good comment in chat, so please take a look at that. But that concludes my section here. I invite you again, ask me any questions later on, email me, or we'll try to figure out if what the right way to do it is if we don't know offhand. Okay, thank you. And Gwen still has a few things to talk
I have
about.
just a few things. And what I'm going to say about these few things, I think apply to some of the questions that we've heard. The Episcopal Church is, it's the historians. They want to be able to record this and have some idea of what the impact has been on the church. And we're going to do our best to give them that information. The attendance, I think, matters, especially the attendance where we were actually able to count it in a reasonable way. But a lot of this is still in the mystery stage. So I wouldn't lose too much sleep over some of these things, especially like the things that I'm going to show you now. There is a new page with narrative questions. Clergy, vestry, and staff encouraged to participate. And I know that some of you are just clutching your hearts right now thinking, I don't have one spare minute to answer more questions. Notice that you're just encouraged. But I would also say they're simple questions. You are not being asked to write the great American novel. You can just quickly make a few notes. What did you learn? Challenges. 3 things that have changed the most in how the church conducts its ministry. In that these are narrative, it's not like they're going to be able to, sort them in an Excel spreadsheet or anything. So someone will actually just be reading them, I'm guessing, for overall sense of the reality of church in 2020. So I encourage you to answer these, but to not stress over your answers. Like I said, it does not have to be the great American novel. This last page is the same as it has been in the past. Or this next page. This last page, outreach ministry and volunteer activity, this has changed somewhat because they have now added, instead of just estimating the number of people served, they've added the estimated number of volunteers an estimated number of new volunteers. And I think these are interesting columns, and do your best to answer these questions. So, you know, like the food pantry, soup kitchen, or meal projects, I'm guessing that Ministry of the Congregation, if you were contributing food to the San Diego Food Bank, how would you, Kirby, would you call that a Ministry of the Congregation, or would you just put over here? Because it's really the food bank. This column is interesting to me.
Well, it kind of it kind of depends on how you define your mission. You know, it gets back to whether it's an operating expense or not. I think in that example that would be considered outreach of the like the line item outreach that we had on line 13.
Guess what? I read the manual.
Oh, nice.
It answered my question. I think it will, by clicking this, it's what will alert them to look for the numbers. So if you if your congregation participates in any way in these outreach events, outreach ministries, click and then answer the rest to the best of your ability. All right.
Cindy, I noticed a raised hand. Do you have a question?
Oh, I'm sorry. Nope. I'm done.
Oh, okay.
No worries. So I've posted our email addresses in the chat. You know how to find us. We will answer questions. March 1st is super important. It makes a difference to your diocese staff. So,
please.
Please, we will assist as much as we can. Any final questions before we say goodnight? Oh, we finished in an hour.
I'm back.
Yes.
Gwynn, I want to ask one other question. And now I've kind of went out of my head. I'm sorry. Because I started emailing it. I'll just email it to you guys.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
All right.
Okay. Thank you all. Really appreciate your attendance.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Have a good evening.
You
Okay.
too. Thanks to
Bye-bye.
everybody.